The night was dark, and the air smelled of burning wood. Deep in the forest, Amina ran, her breath heavy, her heart pounding. Behind her, the sound of footsteps grew closer. She could hear the voices of the king's guards, their torches lighting up the trees. She knew what would happen if they caught her. They would take her back to the palace, and she would never see the man she loved again. Amina was the daughter of King Jemba, ruler of the great kingdom of Damaji. The man she loved was Kojo, a hunter from Zimbi, the forbidden village. Their love was a crime. The king had sworn that any man from Zimbi who dared to love a woman from Damaji would face death. But love did not follow laws. Amina and Kojo had defied the king. They had planned to escape together, to leave behind the hatred of the past. But now, Amina was alone, running for her life. Amina's foot caught on a root. She fell hard, her hands scraping against the damp earth. Pain shot through her ankle as she struggled to get up. Before she could move, strong hands grabbed her arms, pulling her to her feet. She gasped as she looked into the cold eyes of the king's guards. "Take her to the palace," one of them ordered. Amina fought, but it was useless. Her wrists were tied, and she was dragged back toward the place she had tried to escape. Tears streamed down her face. She had failed. She had promised Kojo they would run away together. Now, she was a prisoner once more. The palace was as grand as ever, but to Amina, it felt like a cage. She was forced into the great hall, where her father, King Jemba, sat on his golden throne. His dark eyes burned with fury. "You have shamed your family," he said, his voice sharp as a blade. "You will never see that boy again." Amina lifted her chin. "Father, I love him." The king's expression darkened. He let out a cold laugh. "Love? You are a princess. Your duty is to marry a noble man from Damaji. That is the law." Amina clenched her fists. "Why do you hate Zimbi so much?" For a moment, something flickered in her father's eyes: pain, fear, regret. But it disappeared as quickly as it came. "You will never understand," he said. Then he turned to his guards. "Lock her in the tower. She will remain there until she forgets that boy." Amina screamed as the guards dragged her away. But deep in her heart, she knew one thing: she would never forget Kojo. And she would never give up. Meanwhile, in Zimbi, Kojo stood outside the village elder's hut. His hands shook as he knocked on the wooden door. The elder, an old man named Baba Jengo, opened it with a frown. "You should not be here," Baba Jengo said. "I need help," Kojo said. "The king's men took Amina. I have to save her." Baba Jengo sighed. "The king is dangerous. He will never allow you to be together." Kojo's jaw tightened. "Then I will fight for her." The old man studied him for a long time. Then, he finally spoke. "Come inside. There is something you must know." Inside the hut, the fire burned low. Shadows danced on the walls as Baba Jengo sat down. "There is a reason King Jemba hates Zimbi," he said. "Many years ago, he was in love with a woman from this village. But the elders of Damaji forbade it. They forced him to marry a noblewoman, and he never forgave Zimbi for taking his love away." Kojo's eyes widened. "So he is punishing his own daughter for something that happened to him?" Baba Jengo nodded. "Hatred blinds a man. But if you want to save Amina, you must be careful. The king will not show mercy." Kojo did not sleep that night. He sat outside, staring at the stars, thinking of Amina. He knew one thing: he could not leave her in that palace. He had to do something. And so, before the sun rose, Kojo took his bow and arrows and set off toward Damaji. Inside the palace tower, Amina sat by the window, staring at the distant forest. Her heart ached for Kojo. She could not stay here. She had to escape. She heard footsteps outside her door. The lock turned. A guard entered with a tray of food. Amina saw her chance. With a sudden move, she grabbed the guard's dagger from his belt. Before he could react, she held the blade to his throat. "Let me go," she whispered. The guard hesitated. He was young, not much older than her. He swallowed hard and glanced at the door. "If they catch you, they will kill you," he said. Amina's grip tightened. "Then I will die trying." The guard sighed. And then, he stepped aside. Amina did not wait. She slipped past him, her heart racing. She knew the palace well. She ran through the halls, down the staircase, and into the courtyard. But just as she reached the outer gates, a deep voice stopped her. "Going somewhere?" Amina turned. King Jemba stood there, his eyes filled with rage. "You will never leave this palace," he said. Amina's hands trembled. But before she could answer, a sudden cry rang out. A guard stumbled into the courtyard, an arrow in his back. And behind him, Kojo stood with his bow raised. The palace erupted into chaos. Guards ran toward Kojo, swords drawn. Amina gasped. She had not expected him to come for her this soon. Kojo shot another arrow, but there were too many guards. Within seconds, they surrounded him, dragging him to the ground. The king walked toward him, his face dark with fury. "You dare come here," he spat. Kojo struggled against the guards. "I love your daughter." The king's jaw tightened. "Then you will die for it." Amina screamed as the guards raised their swords. But just before they could strike, a deep, thundering voice echoed through the courtyard. "Stop!" Everyone froze. At the palace gates, an old woman stood, her cloak billowing in the wind. King Jemba's face went pale. "Mother," he whispered. Amina and Kojo looked at each other in shock. The queen mother had returned. Silence fell over the courtyard. The guards, their swords still raised, hesitated. No one had expected to see the queen mother again, not after all these years. She stepped forward, her silver hair glowing under the moonlight, her sharp eyes fixed on King Jemba. "Lower your weapons," she commanded. The guards obeyed without question. The power in her voice was undeniable. Amina's heart pounded. She had never met her grandmother, but she had heard whispers, stories of a queen who had disappeared long ago, of a woman who had once held the heart of the king before she vanished without a trace. And now, here she was. King Jemba took a step forward. His face, always so unreadable, was suddenly filled with emotions Amina had never seen before, shock, anger, and something deeper. "Why are you here?" His voice was low, almost trembling. The queen mother's gaze did not waver. "I came because you are about to make the same mistake that was made with you." Amina's breath caught in her throat. "What do you mean?" she asked, daring to speak. Her grandmother's eyes softened as she looked at her. "You love him?" Amina nodded. "With all my heart." The queen mother turned back to the king. "And you would kill this boy for loving her?" Jemba's jaw tightened. "He broke the law." "The same law that broke you," the queen mother said. Kojo, who had been silent all this time, finally spoke. "I did not come here to start a war," he said. "I came because I love Amina. And I will never stop loving her." Jemba turned to him, his face cold. "You are a hunter. What future can you give her?" Kojo lifted his chin. "The same future you wanted once." The words hung in the air. For the first time, King Jemba looked uncertain. For a long time, no one spoke. The wind rustled through the trees, carrying the smell of burning torches and damp earth. Then, at last, Jemba sighed. He turned to the guards. "Let him go." Gasps echoed through the courtyard. The guards hesitated, but when they saw the look in the king's eyes, they obeyed. Kojo was released. Amina ran to him, tears streaming down her face. She threw her arms around him, holding him tightly. "I thought I lost you," she whispered. Kojo held her just as tightly. "I would have come for you, no matter what." A deep sadness flickered in Jemba's eyes as he watched them. Perhaps he was seeing a younger version of himself, a version that had been robbed of happiness. The Queen Mother stepped forward once more. "End this hatred, Jemba. Change the law." Jemba took a deep breath. "The people will not accept it. They will follow if you lead," she said. "Be the king who unites, not the king who destroys." Jemba closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, something had shifted. Then, he spoke. "The law is no more." A stunned silence followed. Then murmurs, then cheers. The king had done the unthinkable. Amina looked at her father, tears shining in her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. Jemba did not answer. He only turned and walked back into the palace. As the crowd slowly dispersed, Amina and Kojo stood together, hand in hand. It was over. They had won. But deep inside the palace, King Jemba sat alone, staring at the flames of his torch. Remembering a love he had lost long ago. And wondering if it was too late for him to find it again. The news spread like wildfire. The people of Damaji and Zimbi whispered in amazement, King Jemba had broken the ancient law. For the first time in history, love between the two villages was no longer a crime. But not everyone was pleased. Deep within the shadows of the palace, Chief Gundo, one of the king's oldest advisors, sat fuming. His wrinkled hands gripped his staff tightly, his face twisted in anger. "This is a mistake," he muttered. Beside him, two noblemen nodded. "The people of Zimbi cannot be trusted," one said. "They are the reason the king suffered," the other added. Chief Gundo's eyes burned with hatred. "If the king is too weak to see the truth," he said, "then we must take matters into our own hands." That night, as the kingdom celebrated, Amina and Kojo sat under a mango tree, watching the stars. "I still can't believe it," Amina whispered. "We're free." Kojo smiled. "Your love gave me strength, Amina. I would have fought the whole kingdom for you." She rested her head on his shoulder, feeling the warmth of his skin. But deep inside, a strange feeling gnawed at her. Something didn't feel right. And she was not wrong. In the dead of night, a group of masked men slipped through the palace corridors. Silent as shadows, they made their way to the king's chambers. Chief Gundo led them. The door creaked open, revealing King Jemba asleep on his bed. With a nod, the men stepped forward, knives glinting in the moonlight. But just as they were about to strike, the Queen Mother's voice rang through the room. "Traitors!" Jemba's eyes flew open. The Queen Mother stood in the doorway, her sharp gaze locking onto the assassins. The guards outside rushed in, their swords drawn. Gundo snarled. "Foolish woman!" He lunged at the Queen Mother with his dagger. But before he could reach her, Jemba grabbed his sword from beside the bed and slashed through the air. Blood splattered the floor. Gundo gasped, clutching his stomach. He fell to his knees, his eyes wide with shock. The other traitors dropped their weapons, trembling. The king's voice was cold. "Lock them in the dungeons." By morning, the whole kingdom knew of the betrayal. The people gathered in the palace courtyard as the prisoners were brought before them. Jemba stepped forward, his face grim. "For years, I ruled with fear," he said. "I let hatred cloud my judgment. But today, I make a new decree." The crowd held its breath. From this day forward, Damaji and Zimbi will be one. There will be no more war, no more forbidden love. We will build a future together. Cheers erupted. Amina's heart swelled with pride. Her father had changed. The queen mother turned to Jemba. "You have done what many kings could not," she said. Jemba exhaled, his eyes tired. "But at what cost? I have lost so much." She touched his arm gently. "It is never too late to find love again." Jemba's eyes flickered with something unreadable. And deep in his heart, he wondered if there was still a chance for him. That evening, as the sun set over Damaji, Kojo and Amina stood before the people. Under the blessing of the elders, they were officially joined as husband and wife. The celebration lasted through the night. Laughter, drumming, and dancing filled the air. For the first time in years, both villages celebrated as one. But as Amina twirled in Kojo's arms, she felt that same unease again. The danger had not passed. Something, or someone, was still watching from the shadows. And soon, they would strike. Far beyond the village, in the dense forest, a hooded figure knelt before a fire. "The king has betrayed us," the figure said. "He has forgotten the blood of the past." A circle of warriors sat around him, their faces hidden behind masks. "The war is not over," the figure continued. "We will remind him." A warrior stepped forward. "What do you command?" The hooded figure's eyes glowed with fury. "We take the throne." Back in the palace, King Jemba stared at the night sky. The Queen Mother's words echoed in his mind. "It is never too late to find love again." His thoughts wandered to a time long ago, to a face he had never forgotten. But before he could reflect any further, a soldier burst into the chamber. "My king," the soldier gasped. "There is news from the northern border." Jemba's stomach tightened. "What news?" The soldier hesitated. Then, he spoke. "An army is coming." Amina and Kojo stood on the palace balcony, watching the torches in the distance. A great force was gathering. A war was coming. Kojo took Amina's hand. "No matter what happens, we fight together." She squeezed his hand. "Always." And as the first war drums echoed through the night, they knew. Their story was far from over. The war drums echoed across the land. Damaji and Zimbi stood together for the first time, preparing for battle. The northern invaders were ruthless warriors, led by the hooded figure who had sworn to take the throne. In the palace, King Jemba gathered his warriors. Kojo stood beside him, his bow strapped across his back. Amina refused to stay behind. She stood tall, her face fierce with determination. "We will not let them destroy what we have built," Jemba declared. The warriors roared in agreement. And at dawn, the battle began. The enemy army stormed the palace gates, their blades gleaming. Damaji's warriors clashed with them, swords ringing against metal. Kojo fought with the skill of a hunter, his arrows striking down enemies with deadly precision. Amina moved swiftly through the battlefield, helping the wounded, her heart pounding with fear for the man she loved. King Jemba fought like a man possessed. For the first time in years, he felt alive. He was no longer fighting for power, he was fighting for his people, for his family. But then, the hooded figure appeared. The enemy leader stepped forward, pulling back his hood. A gasp ran through the battlefield. It was Chief Gundo. He had escaped the dungeons and gathered the northern warriors to overthrow the king. Jemba's eyes burned with fury. "You betrayed your own kingdom." Gundo sneered. "You betrayed Damaji when you let your weakness rule you." He raised his sword. "And now, I will take what is rightfully mine." The final battle had begun. Gundo was skilled, but Jemba was stronger. The two men clashed, steel against steel, their warriors fighting around them. Kojo saw an enemy creeping behind Jemba, ready to strike. Without thinking, he let an arrow fly. It pierced the attacker's chest just in time. Jemba glanced at Kojo, something like respect flickering in his eyes. But the distraction cost him. Gundo struck. His blade sliced across Jemba's side, and the king staggered, blood staining his robes. Amina screamed. Kojo lunged forward, fury in his eyes. Gundo turned to strike Kojo, but Kojo was faster. He ducked, spun, and drove his knife into Gundo's chest. The traitor's eyes widened. He fell to his knees, choking on his last breath. And just like that, the battle was over. The enemy forces, seeing their leader dead, fled into the forests. Damaji and Zimbi warriors let out victorious cries. But Amina wasn't celebrating. She was kneeling beside her father, pressing her hands against his wound. "Stay with me," she begged. The palace healers rushed to Jemba's side, treating his wound. The queen mother held his hand, whispering words of comfort. For days, the king remained in his chambers, weak but alive. Kojo and Amina stayed by his side, refusing to leave. And finally, one morning, Jemba opened his eyes. His voice was weak, but steady. "You saved me." Kojo nodded. "You saved us first." Jemba exhaled, looking at Kojo. Then, he turned to Amina. "I was wrong," he admitted. "Love is not weakness." Amina's eyes filled with tears. "Does that mean?" Jemba gave a tired smile. "Yes. You have my blessing." The kingdom rejoiced. Kojo and Amina's wedding was the grandest the land had ever seen. People from Damaji and Zimbi danced together, celebrating the union that had once been forbidden. And for the first time in his life, King Jemba watched with a heart free of hatred. The queen mother sat beside him, her eyes twinkling. "Perhaps it is time for you to find love again," she said. Jemba chuckled. "Perhaps." And as the music played, he thought of the woman he had once loved, the one he had lost. Maybe, just maybe, he would find her again. The years passed, and Damaji and Zimbi thrived as one kingdom. Amina and Kojo ruled together, leading with kindness and wisdom. King Jemba lived to see his first grandchild, a strong and fearless girl named Naya. He held her in his arms, whispering, "You will be the greatest queen our land has ever known." And when the time came for him to leave this world, he did so in peace, knowing he had righted his wrongs. On the anniversary of Jemba's passing, Kojo and Amina stood before his grave, their hands intertwined. "He changed," Amina whispered. "In the end, he truly changed." Kojo kissed her forehead. "And because of that, we are here." Amina smiled. The past had been painful, but the future was bright. Their love had survived war, betrayal, and hatred. And now, it would live on. As the sun set over Damaji, the people gathered in the village square, telling the story of the king who once forbade love. And the daughter who proved that love conquers all. And so, the tale of Amina and Kojo became legend, passed down from generation to generation. A tale of love. A tale of war. A tale of a king who learned that the greatest power of all was love. The end.